At my cousin's wedding, I watched my fiancé Daniel slow dance with a woman who looked vaguely familiar. When she whispered something in his ear and he threw back his head laughing, I finally recognized her. It was Kayley Lynch, my obsessed college roommate who'd been stalking me for 3 years. I smiled, took a photo, and quietly slipped away. What Daniel didn't know was that Kaylee's obsession with me ran so deep, she was about to destroy his life just to get closer to mine.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're a subscriber, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Tell us a duh.
The Riverside Gardens looked like something out of a fairy tale that Saturday evening in late September. My cousin June's wedding reception was in full swing under the twinkling lights strung between ancient oak trees. White roses and baby's breath adorned every table, and the soft glow of lanterns created the perfect romantic atmosphere for celebrating new love. I should have been enjoying myself. After all, Daniel Everett and I were supposed to be next. Our own wedding was scheduled for December, just 3 months away. The save the dates had been sent, the venue booked, and my dress was hanging in our bedroom closet, still wrapped in protective plastic. But something felt wrong tonight. Daniel had been acting strange for weeks. Distant phone calls he'd taken another room, sudden changes in his schedule, and that new secretive quality that made me feel like I was living with a stranger. When I'd asked about it, he'd blamed work stress from his promotion at the architectural firm. "Just give me some space to sort things out," he'd said last Tuesday when I'd tried to discuss our seating chart. "The Peterson project is killing me, and I need to focus." So I'd backed off, telling myself that pre-wedding jitters were normal. We'd been together for 2 years, engaged for 8 months. Every couple went through rough patches. But watching him now, spinning another woman around the dance floor while I sat alone at our table, I realized this wasn't about work stress or wedding anxiety. The woman in his arms was stunning in that effortless way some people just possessed. Long auburn hair that caught the light as she moved, a emerald green dress that probably cost more than my monthly salary, and a laugh that carried across the entire reception area. She moved with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing you're the most beautiful woman in the room. But it wasn't her beauty that made my stomach clench with recognition. It was something about the way she held her head, the familiar gesture of tucking her hair behind her left ear, the slight tilt of her chin when she smiled. I knew that face. I pulled out my phone, pretending to check messages while I studied her more carefully through the camera. The angle was better this way, and I could zoom in slightly without being obvious about staring. That's when it hit me like a physical blow. Kayley Lynch, my roommate from junior and senior year at UCLA. The same Kayley who'd gradually become obsessed with every aspect of my life, who'd tried to copy my major, date my boyfriends, and even applied to the same graduate programs I'd been considering. The same Kayley who'd made my last year of college a living hell with her increasingly unstable behavior. But that had been 3 years ago. I'd moved to San Francisco right after graduation specifically to get away from her, and I'd thought that chapter of my life was permanently closed. What was she doing here? How had she even known about June's wedding? And why was my fiancé holding her like she was the most precious thing in the world? I watched them dance through 2 more songs, noting the way Daniel's hand resting possessively on her lower back, how naturally they moved together, the intimate way they leaned in to whisper to each other. This wasn't the awkward interaction of strangers who'd just met at a wedding. This was the comfortable intimacy of 2 people who knew each other well, very well. My mind raced through the past few months, reframing Daniel's behavior with this new information. The mysterious phone calls that had started around the same time he'd gotten his promotion, the weekend trips to visit clients that had become more frequently lately, the way he'd become vague about his schedule, claiming his new position required more flexibility. "Elena?" I looked up to find my cousin June approaching, radiant in her wedding dress but wearing a concerned expression. "Are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." I forced a smile, closing my phone camera and slipping it back into my purse. Just taking a break from all the dancing. Beautiful wedding, by the way. Everything looks perfect. June followed my gaze toward the dance floor, where Daniel and Kayley were now engaged in what looked like an intense conversation. Who's Daniel dancing with? I don't remember her from the guest list. I'm not sure, I lied smoothly. Probably someone's plus one. But even as I said it, I was calculating. June's wedding had been planned meticulously, with a specific head count for catering and seating arrangements. Every guest had been accounted for, every plus one confirmed weeks in advance. There was no way Kayley was here as someone's legitimate date. Which meant she'd crashed the wedding specifically to get to Daniel. Or to get to me. Well, she's certainly beautiful, June said diplomatically, though it's a bit rude to monopolize someone else's date for so long. I nodded absently, my attention focused on trying to piece together how this had happened. How had Kayley found Daniel? How long had they been seeing each other? And most importantly, what did she want? Because if there was one thing I'd learned during our 2 years as roommates, it was that Kayley Lynch never did anything without a carefully calculated purpose. She was obsessed with having what other people had, but more than that, she was obsessed with proving she could take it away from them. In college, it had been relatively harmless, copying my outfits, trying to join the same clubs, flirting with guys I was interested in. But by senior year, her behavior had escalated to something much more disturbing. She'd started reading my emails, following me to study groups, and even showing up at places where I'd told her I wouldn't be. The final straw had been when I'd found her going through my personal journal, copying down names and details about my family, my childhood, my future plans. When I'd confronted her about it, she'd acted like it was perfectly normal roommate behavior. I just want to understand you better, she'd said with that innocent smile that never quite reached her eyes. We're friends, aren't we? Friends share everything. I'd moved out the next week, spending my last month of college crashing on other friends' couches, rather than sharing space with someone who'd made it clear she wanted to absorb my identity completely. Now, watching her dance with my fiancé at my cousin's wedding, I realized she'd never stopped. The song ended, and I watched Daniel lead Kayley toward the bar, his hand still resting on her back with casual intimacy. They moved like a couple, comfortable and familiar, and I felt something cold settle in my chest. This wasn't a chance encounter. This wasn't even a simple affair. This was Kayley Lynch doing what she'd always done best, systematically inserting herself into my life and taking what she wanted. But this time, she'd made a crucial mistake. This time, I was ready for her. I excused myself from June's conversation and made my way toward the restroom, keeping my movements casual while my mind raced through memories I'd tried to forget. The hallway leading away from the reception area was quieter, lined with vintage photographs of the venue's garden through the decades. I needed space to think, to process what I'd just discovered. Kayley Lynch hadn't just been an overly attached roommate. She'd been a psychological nightmare disguised as friendship, and I'd spent 2 years making excuses for increasingly disturbing behavior because I'd been too polite, too naive to recognize what was really happening. It had started innocently enough our junior year. Kayley had seemed like the perfect roommate match, clean, studious, from a good family in Orange County. She'd been majoring in psychology while I was in communications, so we didn't have overlapping classes or competition issues. At first, I'd been flattered by her interest in my life. "You have such great style," she'd say. "Where did you learn to put outfits together like that?" Within a week, she'd bought nearly identical versions of my favorite clothes. When I'd mentioned it, she'd laughed it off. Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, right? Besides, we have similar coloring. What looks good on you will probably look good on me too. It had seemed harmless then, even when she'd started copying my hairstyle, my study habits, even the way I organized our shared spaces. I'd told myself she was just trying to figure out her own identity, that lots of college students went through experimental phases. But then it had escalated. She'd started showing up at places where I'd told her I wouldn't be. Coffee shops where I'd mentioned meeting study groups. Restaurants where I'd said I was having lunch with other friends. Always with a convenient excuse. She'd been in the neighborhood, she'd forgotten something, pure coincidence. "Elena," she'd say with that bright, innocent smile, "what a surprise. Mind if I join you?" And because I'd been raised to be polite, because I'd wanted to believe her explanations, I'd always said yes. The friends I'd been meeting had started making jokes about my shadow, asking if Kayley ever did anything without me.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
I'd laughed along, but privately, I'd begun to feel suffocated. She'd started inserting herself into every aspect of my social life, my academic life, even my family phone calls. "Tell your mom I said hi," she'd call from across our dorm room whenever my parents called. "Ask her how the garden is doing." How had she even known my mother was interested in gardening? I'd never mentioned it to her. That's when I'd started noticing the small violations of privacy. My laptop left open on pages I hadn't been viewing. My journal moved slightly from where I'd left it. Personal items rearranged in ways that were subtle, but unmistakable if you paid attention. The breaking point had come during spring semester of senior year, when I'd started dating Marcus Coleman from my advanced writing seminar. Kayley had been immediately interested in every detail: what he looked like, what he studied, where he was from, what our conversations were like. "He sounds amazing," she'd said after I'd mentioned our third date. "I'd love to meet him sometime." A week later, I'd found her in the campus library, sitting at Marcus's usual study table, engaged in what looked like an intense conversation. When I'd approached, she'd waved cheerfully. "Elena, perfect timing. I was just getting to know Marcus. He's even more wonderful than you described." Marcus had looked uncomfortable, clearly not understanding how my roommate had known exactly where to find him, or so many personal details about his life that I'd shared with her in private. That night, I'd confronted her about it. "It's weird, Kayley. You sought him out specifically. How did you even know where he'd be?" "You mentioned he always studies on the third floor of the library," she'd said, with that innocent expression she'd perfected. "I was there anyway for my psychology research, and I recognized him from your description. I thought it would be nice to introduce myself." But I'd never told her Marcus studied on the third floor. I'd never even told her which library he preferred. That's when I'd started paying closer attention to the things she knew that I'd never shared with her. Details about my childhood, my family's financial situation, my academic goals. Information that could only have come from reading my personal emails, my journal, possibly even my conversations with my parents when I thought she wasn't listening. The final confrontation had happened 2 weeks before graduation. I'd come back to our room unexpectedly and found her sitting at my desk, my laptop open, scrolling through what looked like my personal emails. She hadn't even looked guilty when I'd caught her. "I was just curious about your internship applications," she'd said calmly. "I thought maybe I could apply to some of the same places." "Those are private emails, Kayley. You can't just go through my personal correspondence." "We're roommates," she'd replied, as if that explained everything. "Besides, I want to understand your decision-making process. You're so good at getting what you want. I want to learn from you." The way she'd said it, with that intense focus that had become increasingly common in her interactions with me, had finally made me understand what I'd been dealing with for 2 years. Kayley Lynch wasn't just an overly friendly roommate or even a clingy friend. She was obsessed with becoming me. Now, standing in the quiet hallway of the wedding venue, I realized she'd never stopped. 3 years after graduation, she'd somehow found Daniel and inserted herself into his life the same way she'd inserted herself into mine in college. But this time was different. This time, she hadn't just stolen a boyfriend or copied my academic plans. This time, she'd stolen my future husband. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through Daniel's social media profiles, something I rarely did because I'd always trusted him completely. But looking at his recent posts with new eyes, I started noticing things I'd missed before. Photos from his business trips that showed locations he'd never mentioned to me. Check-ins at restaurants during times when he'd told me he was working late. And in the background of several recent photos, barely visible but unmistakable once I knew what to look for, was a figure with auburn hair and familiar mannerisms. Kayley had been in Daniel's life for months, maybe longer, and I'd been completely oblivious. I heard footsteps approaching and quickly put my phone away, turning toward the mirror to check my appearance. I needed to look composed when I rejoined the reception. I needed to think strategically about what came next. Because if there was one thing my 2 years with Kayley had taught me, it was that confronting her directly never worked. She was too skilled at manipulation, too good at making herself look like the innocent party while making her targets seem paranoid or jealous. But this time, I had something she didn't know I had: experience with her methods. And this time, I wasn't going to be the naive college student who made excuses for inexcusable behavior. This time, I was going to be ready for whatever game she was playing. I took a deep breath and returned to the reception, my mind now razor-sharp with purpose. The first thing I needed to do was gather information without alerting either Daniel or Kayley that I'd recognized her. But as I approached our table, I noticed it was empty. Both of them had disappeared from the dance floor. A quick scan of the reception area revealed them standing near the garden entrance, engaged in what looked like an intimate conversation. Daniel's hand was resting on Kayley's shoulder, and she was looking up at him with that same adoring expression I'd seen her use on countless targets in college. I needed to get closer without being noticed. The bar was positioned perfectly to give me a clear view while appearing to be focused on ordering a drink. I made my way over, ordered a glass of wine I didn't want, and positioned myself where I could observe them while pretending to check my phone. "Can't keep doing this much longer," Kayley was saying, her voice carrying just enough for me to catch fragments. "She's going to figure it out eventually." "No, she won't," Daniel replied with a confidence that made my stomach turn. Elena's too trusting. She believes everything I tell her about work pressure and wedding stress. She has no idea what's really going on. I felt like I'd been slapped. The casual dismissal in his voice, the way he talked about my trust like it was a character flaw rather than a gift I'd given him freely. "But what about after the wedding?" Kayley continued. "What's the long-term plan here?" Daniel glanced around to make sure no one was listening, then leaned closer to her. "We stick to what we discussed. I go through with the ceremony, we take the honeymoon in Italy that she's already paid for, and then I file for divorce 6 months later. Irreconcilable differences. By then, all the wedding gifts will be past the return period, and I'll have had time to move assets around." My wine glass nearly slipped from my fingers. He was planning to marry me just to rob me blind. "And then we can finally be together openly," Kayley said, her voice taking on that needy quality I remembered all too well. "Exactly. You've been so patient, Kay. I know this hasn't been easy, watching me pretend to love her." Pretend to love me. The words echoed in my head like a death sentence for everything I'd believed about our relationship. I turned away from them, my mind reeling with the implications of what I'd just heard. This wasn't just an affair. This was a calculated scheme, and Kayley wasn't just the other woman. She was the architect of the entire plan. Suddenly, everything made perfect sense. The way Kayley had always been obsessed with taking what belonged to me, the way she'd studied my preferences, my habits, my vulnerabilities. She'd spent 2 years in college learning exactly how to manipulate me, and now she was using that knowledge to destroy my life systematically. But how had she found Daniel in the first place? I pulled out my phone and opened my social media apps, searching through my older posts with new eyes. There it was. A photo I'd posted 8 months ago of Daniel and me at a charity gala for his architectural firm. I'd tagged him and mentioned how proud I was of his promotion to senior partner. That's how she'd found him, through my own social media posts. I scrolled back further, looking for the pattern I was now certain existed. Every major milestone in my relationship with Daniel had been documented online. Our anniversary dinner at Chez Laurent, the weekend trip to Napa Valley where he'd proposed, even photos of us looking at venues for our wedding. Kayley had been watching my life unfold from a distance, gathering information, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And when Daniel had gotten his promotion, making him a financially attractive target, she'd made her move. I thought back to when Daniel's behavior had first started changing. It had been about 4 months ago, right around the time he'd mentioned getting friend requests from old college acquaintances. I thought it was sweet that people from his past were reaching out to reconnect. Some girl from UCLA found me through LinkedIn, he'd said casually one evening. Says she thinks we might have mutual friends. Small world, right? UCLA, the same school where Kayley and I had been roommates. She'd approached him through a fake connection, probably claiming to know me or one of his other contacts. And Daniel, being naturally social and trusting, had welcomed the contact without suspicion. From there, it would have been easy for her to work her magic. Kayley had always been beautiful, charming when she wanted to be, and incredibly skilled at reading people's weaknesses. She would have studied Daniel the same way she'd studied me in college, figuring out exactly what he wanted to hear, what his insecurities were, how to make herself indispensable. And she had one crucial piece of information that gave her a massive advantage. She knew everything about me. Every complaint I'd ever made about our relationship, every insecurity I'd shared with my journal that she'd undoubtedly read, every detail about my personality and preferences that she'd observed during our 2 years as roommates. She'd been able to position herself as everything I wasn't, to offer Daniel everything I apparently wasn't giving him. The truly sickening part was realizing that Daniel's recent criticisms of me, complaints I thought were just pre-wedding stress, had probably been planted by Kayley. "Elena's been so focused on work lately," he'd said a few weeks ago. "Sometimes I feel like I'm not a priority in her life." "You seem stressed about the wedding planning," he'd mentioned another time. "Maybe you're not ready for this kind of commitment." Comments that had made me question myself, that had made me try harder to be the perfect fiancé, to prove that I was ready for marriage. I'd been competing against myself without even knowing it, trying to measure up to standards that Kayley had helped define based on her intimate knowledge of my insecurities. But there was something Daniel didn't know about Kayley Lynch. She never stopped at just taking what she wanted. Once she had it, she destroyed it, because the conquest was never really about the prize. It was about proving she could take it away from me. In college, she hadn't just stolen my boyfriend Marcus. She'd systematically alienated him from his friends, made him question his academic goals, and eventually driven him to transfer schools just to get away from the toxicity she'd brought into his life. She'd done the same thing with every target she'd focused on during our time as roommates. The professor she'd developed a crush on had ended up requesting a transfer to another department after she'd made his professional life a nightmare with her obsessive behavior. The graduate program she'd wanted to join had mysteriously received anonymous complaints about their admission process after they'd rejected her application. Kayley didn't just want to win. She wanted to destroy everything in the process, leaving nothing but wreckage behind her. And now she had Daniel exactly where she wanted him, emotionally dependent on her, financially planning to betray me, and completely unaware that he was dealing with someone who would eventually turn her destructive tendencies on him too. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But first, I needed to decide exactly how I was going to handle this situation. Because for the first time in 3 years, I had something Kayley didn't know I had: advance warning of her methods. And this time, I wasn't going to be her victim. I finished my wine slowly, using the time to formulate a plan. The smart thing would be to leave immediately, go home, and start protecting my assets before confronting Daniel about what I discovered. But looking at Kayley across the garden, seeing that triumphant smile I remembered so well from college, I realized I needed to understand the full scope of what she'd done. More importantly, I needed her to know that I knew. I waited until they separated, Daniel heading toward the men's room while Kayley moved to touch up her makeup. This was my opportunity. I followed her into the ladies' lounge, an elegant space with vintage mirrors and soft lighting that made everyone look like they were in an old Hollywood movie. Kayley was standing at the vanity, reapplying lipstick with the same meticulous precision she'd used for everything in college. She saw me in the mirror before I spoke, and for just a moment, her composed mask slipped. I caught a flash of pure satisfaction in her eyes before she rearranged her features into surprise. "Oh my goodness," she said, turning around with that practiced smile. Elena Coleman, I can't believe it." The fact that she'd used my maiden name wasn't lost on me. She knew exactly who I was and why I was here. "It's Elena Morrison now," I said calmly, not bothering to return her fake enthusiasm. "I kept my name when I got engaged." "Engaged!" she exclaimed, her acting skills as sharp as ever. "How wonderful! When's the wedding?" "December," I replied, watching her face carefully, though I'm starting to think I might need to reconsider the timing. Something flickered in her expression, a moment of uncertainty that told me she wasn't entirely sure how much I knew. "Oh, cold feet? That's totally normal before a big wedding." I moved closer, positioning myself so that anyone entering would see us having what looked like a friendly conversation. Not cold feet, more like discovering that my fiancé has been having an affair with my obsessive college roommate. The mask dropped completely then. Kayley's smile disappeared, replaced by the cold calculation I remembered from our worst confrontations senior year. "I have no idea what you're talking about," she said, but her voice had lost its sweet tone. "Really, because I just heard you and Daniel discussing your plans for after our wedding. Something about divorce and asset division? Very romantic pillow talk." Kayley studied my face for a long moment, clearly trying to determine her next move. When she spoke again, her voice was entirely different, sharper, more honest, and infinitely more dangerous. "You always were too smart for your own good," she said, leaning against the vanity with casual confidence. "I'd hoped you'd be oblivious until after the honeymoon, but I suppose this works too." "How long?" I asked. "How long what?" "How long have you been planning this? Because I know you didn't just randomly bump into Daniel. This was calculated." Kayley's smile returned, but this time it was genuine and terrifying. "I've been watching your life for 3 years, Elena. Every social media post, every public appearance, every interview in those marketing trade magazines. Did you really think I'd just disappear after graduation?" The casual admission sent chills down my spine. 3 years of stalking, 3 years of planning. "I learned so much about you during our time as roommates," she continued, examining her nails with affected boredom. "All your little insecurities, your relationship patterns, what makes you trust people. It made it incredibly easy to figure out exactly how to approach Daniel." "You're sick," I said quietly. "I'm thorough," she corrected. "You always had everything so easy, Elena. The perfect grades, the perfect internships, the perfect boyfriends. Do you have any idea what it was like watching you coast through life while I had to fight for every scrap of attention? So you decided to destroy my life?" "I decided to take what should have been mine in the first place." Her voice was getting harder, more bitter. "You never appreciated what you had. Daniel told me all about how you take him for granted, how you're always too busy with work to pay attention to him. He was practically begging for someone to actually care about him." "Someone to manipulate him, you mean?" Kayley laughed, a sound completely devoid of warmth. "Same thing, really. Men like Daniel want to feel important, needed. I gave him that. You gave him a roommate who happened to share a bed." The cruelty of her words was designed to hurt, but I found myself analyzing her technique instead of feeling the pain. This was classic Kayley, taking kernels of truth and twisting them into weapons. "What's your endgame here?" I asked. "You get Daniel to marry me, steal whatever money you can, and then what? Live happily ever after with someone you trained to betray the people he claims to love?" "Daniel won't betray me," she said confidently. "I'm not naive enough to trust blindly like you were. I know exactly who he is and what he's capable of. That's what makes us perfect for each other." "You really think a man who would plan to defraud his fiancée won't eventually do the same thing to you?" For the first time, I saw a flicker of uncertainty cross her face, but she recovered quickly. "That's the beautiful thing about understanding someone completely," she said. "I know all of Daniel's weaknesses. I know exactly how to keep him loyal." "Through blackmail?" "Through necessity. By the time I'm finished with him, he'll need me too much to ever consider leaving." The bathroom door opened, and June walked in, looking between us with obvious curiosity about the tension she'd walked into. "Elena, there you are. People are asking where you and Daniel disappeared to." "Just catching up with an old college friend," I said smoothly, not taking my eyes off Kayley. "We were just finishing our conversation." "Actually," Kayley said, her sweet mask sliding back into place, "I was just telling Elena how much I'd love to meet her fiancé. It's been so long since we've had a chance to really talk." "Oh, wonderful," June said, oblivious to the undercurrents. "Elena, you should bring her over to your table. Daniel would love to meet one of your college friends." "Oh, I think they've already met," I said quietly, watching Kayley's eyes narrow slightly. "Briefly," Kayley admitted, "but I'd love to get to know him better." I smiled then, the first genuine smile I'd felt all evening, because in that moment, I realized something Kayley hadn't considered. She'd been so focused on studying me, on understanding my weaknesses and manipulating Daniel, that she'd made a crucial error. She'd underestimated how much I'd learned about her. We walked back to the reception together, June chattering happily about how nice it was that old friends could reconnect at weddings. I let her fill the silence while my mind raced through possibilities. Kayley walked beside us with that serene confidence she'd always worn when she thought she had the upper hand. But I'd caught something in her eyes during our bathroom confrontation, a flicker of uncertainty when I'd mentioned Daniel's capacity for betrayal. She wasn't as confident in her control over him as she wanted me to believe. Daniel was standing near our table when we approached, checking his phone with the distracted air of someone expecting an important message. He looked up when he saw us coming, and I watched his face carefully as his eyes moved from me to Kayley to June. For just a moment, panic flashed across his features before he rearranged them into a welcoming smile. "There you are," he said, moving toward me to place a possessive kiss on my cheek. I was starting to worry. "Just catching up with an old friend," I said, gesturing toward Kayley. "Daniel, I'd like you to meet Kayley Lynch. We were roommates at UCLA." "Kayley," Daniel repeated, extending his hand with practiced charm. "What a pleasure to meet you." I watched them shake hands, noting how they held the contact just a beat too long, how Kayley's fingers lingered on his wrist in a gesture that would look casual to anyone who wasn't paying attention. "The pleasure's all mine," Kayley said, her voice pitched to that perfect tone of friendly interest. "Alana's told me so much about you over the years." The lie rolled off her tongue so smoothly that even I might have believed it if I hadn't known better. But Daniel's eyes sharpened slightly, and I could see him trying to process the implications of her statement. If Kayley and I had been keeping in touch, if I'd been talking about him to college friends, then their secret relationship was far more dangerous than he'd realized. "All good things, I hope," Daniel said carefully. "Oh, absolutely," Kayley replied with that innocent smile. "Though I have to admit, I'm a little surprised. You're not quite what I expected based on Elena's descriptions." Another calculated lie, designed to make Daniel wonder what I'd supposedly been saying about him to my friends. I could see him trying to work out whether this was a threat or an opportunity. "Well," June interjected, "I'll leave you all to get acquainted. Elena, save me a dance later." After June left, an awkward silence settled over our small group. Daniel was clearly trying to figure out how to navigate this unexpected complication, while Kayley seemed to be enjoying his discomfort. "So," Kayley said finally, "what brings you to San Francisco? Are you here for work?" "Actually, I moved here about 6 months ago," Kayley replied, her eyes never leaving his face. "I got a position with a consulting firm downtown, psychology and behavioral analysis." 6 months ago, right around the time Daniel's behavior had started changing. "How interesting," I said quietly. "What kind of consulting?" "Corporate consulting mostly, helping companies understand employee behavior, workplace dynamics, that sort of thing." She paused, then added with false casualness, "Though I do some private consulting too, relationship counseling, family dynamics. People are fascinating when you know how to read them." The threat in her words was subtle but unmistakable. She was letting Daniel know that she understood people's motivations, their weaknesses, their secrets. That must be rewarding work, Daniel said, and I could hear the strain in his voice despite his attempt at normalcy. It is, especially when you can help people see the truth about their relationships. So many people live in denial about what's really going on in their personal lives. She was enjoying this, I realized, the power play, the psychological manipulation, the way she could make both Daniel and me uncomfortable with carefully chosen words. Speaking of relationships, I said, are you seeing anyone, Kayley? I seem to remember you always had interesting taste in men. Her smile faltered slightly. I'm between relationships at the moment, though I have been seeing someone who's currently unavailable. It's complicated. Isn't it always with you? I replied sweetly. Daniel cleared his throat. I should probably get us some drinks. Elena, your usual wine? Actually, I said, making a sudden decision, I think I'd like something stronger. Whiskey on the rocks. Both Daniel and Kayley looked surprised. I'd never ordered whiskey in the 2 years Daniel had known me. Whiskey? Daniel repeated. I feel like tonight calls for something different, I said, meeting his eyes directly. Sometimes you need a drink that matches the occasion. Kayley was watching this exchange with obvious interest, clearly trying to decode the subtext. I'll have the same, she said suddenly. I love whiskey. Another lie. In college, Kayley had been obsessed with appearing sophisticated, but she'd always ordered fruity cocktails when we went out. She was still doing it, copying my choices, trying to mirror my preferences. 2 whiskeys it is, Daniel said, clearly eager to escape the tension. I'll be right back. As soon as he was out of earshot, Kayley turned to me with renewed confidence. This is fun, she said quietly, like old times. Nothing about this is like old times, I replied. In college, you just stole my clothes and my study notes. This time, you're trying to steal my entire life. I'm not trying to steal anything, Kayley said, her voice hardening. I'm taking what should have been mine from the beginning. You never deserved any of it. Not the grades, not the opportunities, and certainly not Daniel. And what makes you think you deserve him? Her smile turned predatory. Because unlike you, I know exactly what he needs. And unlike you, I'm willing to do whatever it takes to keep him happy. Even if it means destroying him in the process? Daniel won't be destroyed. He'll be grateful. Once I remove all the negative influences from his life, he'll finally be able to reach his full potential. The chilling familiarity of her words hit me like a physical blow. She'd said almost exactly the same thing about Marcus in college, right before she'd systematically isolated him from everyone who cared about him. But this time, I wasn't going to stand by and watch it happen. Daniel returned with our drinks, his hands slightly unsteady as he set them down. The whiskey was expensive, top shelf, but I noticed he'd gotten himself a beer instead of joining us in the stronger liquor. Interesting choice for someone who was supposedly celebrating his cousin-in-law's wedding. Thank you, I said, taking a sip of the whiskey and letting it burn down my throat. Perfect choice. Kayley lifted her glass as well, though I caught the slight grimace she tried to hide when the alcohol hit her palate, still pretending to enjoy things she actually hated, just like in college. So, Daniel, Kayley said, settling into the conversation like she belonged there, Elena was just telling me about your work at the architectural firm. Senior partner at such a young age. That's impressive. I hadn't mentioned his promotion to her, which meant she already knew about it from their previous conversations. But she was fishing for information she could use in front of me, trying to see how much I knew about their connection. Elena talks about me to her college friends? Daniel asked, and I could hear the careful probing in his question. Oh, all the time, Kayley lied smoothly. She's so proud of your success. Though I have to say, she's been a little stressed about the wedding planning lately. I hope you're not putting too much pressure on her. The manipulation was masterful. With one comment, she'd positioned herself as my confidant while simultaneously planting the seed that I was unstable, that I couldn't handle normal life pressures. I try to help where I can, Daniel said carefully, but Elena likes to manage the details herself. That's so like her, Kayley replied with false fondness. Always has to be in control of everything. Remember in college, Elena, how you used to get so anxious about group projects? You'd take over everyone else's work because you couldn't trust them to do it right. Another lie, designed to make me sound controlling and neurotic. In reality, I'd been the one who usually ended up doing extra work because Kayley would either sabotage other team members or simply not complete her assigned tasks. I remember things differently, I said quietly, taking another sip of whiskey. Memory is such a funny thing, isn't it? Kayley continued, her tone remaining light even as her words grew sharper. Daniel was watching this exchange with growing unease. He could sense the undercurrent of hostility, but he couldn't decode what was really happening. "You two seem to have a lot of history," he said, clearly trying to navigate the tension. "Oh, we do," Kayley said. Her smile became more genuine as she prepared to deliver what she clearly thought would be a killing blow. "Elena and I were very close in college. I probably know her better than almost anyone." "Really?" Daniel's voice carried a note of curiosity that made my stomach clench. "Absolutely. I know all her little secrets, her insecurities, her patterns in relationships." Kayley's eyes never left my face as she spoke. "For instance, did you know that Elena has a tendency to get very attached very quickly, but then she starts looking for ways to sabotage the relationship when things get serious?"
That's not true, I said, but even as I protested, I could see Daniel's expression changing. "She did it with Marcus in college," Kayley continued relentlessly. "Started picking fights about little things, questioning his commitment, making him feel like he could never measure up to her expectations. The poor guy was walking on eggshells by the end." The revisionist history was breathtaking in its audacity. Marcus had broken up with me because of Kayley's manipulations, not because of anything I'd done. But she was presenting it as if I'd been the toxic one in the relationship. "Elena's never mentioned any of this," Daniel said slowly. "Would you?" Kayley asked with false sympathy. "It's not exactly flattering to admit that you have a pattern of destroying good relationships because you're afraid of genuine intimacy." I felt something cold settle in my chest as I watched Daniel processing her words. This was exactly what she'd done in college, taken real events and twisted them, used intimate knowledge gained through our friendship to create weapons designed to destroy my credibility. But this time, she'd made a crucial error. "You're right," I said suddenly, setting down my whiskey glass with a sharp click. "I do have patterns in relationships. I tend to trust people too easily, to make excuses for behavior that should be obvious red flags." Both Kayley and Daniel looked surprised by my admission. "For instance," I continued, pulling out my phone, "I tend to believe people when they tell me they're working late, even when their location services show them somewhere completely different." I opened Daniel's location sharing, something we'd set up months ago for safety reasons, and turned the screen toward him. The map showed his phone had been at Kayley's apartment address 3 times this week alone, during hours when he'd told me he was at the office. Daniel's face went pale. "Elena, I can explain." "Or," I continued, swiping to my photos, "I tend to trust people even when evidence suggests I shouldn't." I pulled up the picture I'd taken earlier of them dancing together, then swiped to show several more I'd discreetly captured throughout the evening. In one, Daniel's hand was clearly resting on Kayley's lower back in a gesture far too intimate for strangers. In another, they were leaning in close to each other, foreheads almost touching. "These don't look like the interactions of people who just met," I said calmly. Kayley had gone very still, her confident mask finally cracking as she realized I'd been documenting their behavior all evening. "Elena," Daniel started, but I held up my hand. "I'm not finished. You see, Kayley, you're right that I has patterns, but there's one pattern you forgot about." I leaned forward, meeting her eyes directly. I learn from my mistakes. The silence that followed my revelation stretched between us like a wire pulled taut.
Daniel's face had gone through several shades of pale, while Kayley sat frozen, clearly recalculating her position now that she realized I'd been gathering evidence. Elena, Daniel started, but I held up my hand. I'm not finished. You see, Kayley, you're right that I have patterns, but there's one pattern you forgot about. I leaned forward, meeting her eyes directly. I learn from my mistakes. The silence that followed my revelation stretched between us like a wire pulled taut. Daniel's face had gone through several shades of pale, while Kayley sat frozen, clearly recalculating her position now that she realized I'd been gathering evidence. Elena, Daniel started, but I held up my hand. I'm not finished. You see, Kayley, you're right that I have patterns, but there's one pattern you forgot about. I leaned forward, meeting her eyes directly. I learn from my mistakes. The silence that followed my revelation stretched between us like a wire pulled taut. Daniel's face had gone through several shades of pale, while Kayley sat frozen, clearly recalculating her position now that she realized I'd been gathering evidence. You've been planning this for months, I continued, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. Both of you. Elena, please, Daniel started, reaching for my hand across the table. Let me explain. I pulled my hand away before he could touch me. Explain what? How you've been lying to me about working late while you were actually at Kayley's apartment? Or maybe you'd like to explain the conversation I overheard earlier about going through with our wedding just to steal from me? Daniel's eyes darted to Kayley, panic evident in his expression. She gave him an almost imperceptible shake of her head, a silent warning not to admit anything. I don't know what you think you heard, Kayley said carefully, but I think you might be misinterpreting. The wedding gifts past the return period? Asset division after 6 months? Your exact words were irreconcilable differences. Should I continue? The color completely drained from Daniel's face. He opened his mouth, then closed it, clearly struggling to find words that could somehow explain away what I'd witnessed. I pulled out my phone again and opened my banking app. While we're being honest, let's talk about our joint account, shall we? My fingers moved quickly across the screen, pulling up our wedding savings account that we'd opened 6 months ago. The balance showed $847.32. Last week, this account had $23,000, I said, money I've been saving for 2 years to pay for our wedding. Care to explain where it went? Daniel's hands were shaking now. There were expenses. What expenses? I swiped to the transaction history, because according to this, most of the money was withdrawn as cash advances over the past month, large amounts, always when I was at work or traveling for client meetings. I scrolled through the transactions, reading them aloud. August 15th, $3,000 cash advance. August 22nd, $4,500 cash advance. September 3rd, $5,200 cash advance. I looked up at Daniel. That last one was the day you told me you were visiting your mother in Sacramento. Elena, I can explain all of this. Can you explain this too? I swiped to a different screen, showing credit card statements I'd accessed through our shared account. These charges to jewelry stores, high-end restaurants, weekend trips to Napa Valley. All on dates when you told me you were working late or out of town on business. Kayley was watching this financial revelation with obvious discomfort. She'd clearly known about Daniel's theft, but seeing the actual numbers laid out might have been more than she'd bargained for. $23,000, I repeated quietly. Money I saved by working overtime, taking on extra clients, skipping vacations. Money I trusted you to help me manage. It's not what it looks like, Daniel said desperately. I was going to pay it all back. With what money? I asked. Your salary? Because I checked with your firm yesterday when you didn't come home until 3 a.m. They said you'd been taking a lot of personal time lately, and there was some concern about your recent performance. Daniel's face went ashen. He clearly hadn't expected me to verify his work alibis. You've been lying about everything, I continued. Your work schedule, your whereabouts, your financial decisions. Our entire relationship has been built on deception. That's not true, Daniel protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Isn't it? I pulled up another screen on my phone because I also took the liberty of checking our credit reports this morning. Imagine my surprise when I found 3 new credit cards in my name that I never applied for. Kayley went very still. This was clearly news to her, too. Cards with a combined credit limit of $45,000, I continued, all with recent charges for cash advances and luxury purchases. Cards that someone signed my name to authorize. I reached into my purse and pulled out a manila folder I'd prepared earlier that day. I printed out the applications. The signatures are interesting. Close to mine, but not quite right. Almost like someone practiced copying my handwriting but didn't get it perfect. Daniel was staring at the folder like it contained a death sentence. Credit fraud is a federal crime, I said quietly, especially when it involves this much money across state lines. Elena, Kayley said suddenly, her voice taking on a reasonable tone, I think you're jumping to conclusions. Daniel loves you. Daniel loves my bank account, I corrected. And you love the idea of destroying my life. Just like you did in college, except this time the stakes are much higher. I leaned back in my chair, studying both of their faces. But here's what you both failed to consider. Daniel was gripping his beer bottle so tightly his knuckles were white. What? I may have trusted you blindly for 2 years, I said, but I'm not the naive college student Kayley remembers. I've learned a few things about protecting myself. I reached back into my purse and pulled out a small device, a digital recorder I'd been carrying since I'd first suspected something was wrong, including how to document conversations where people confess to financial fraud and conspiracy. The blood drained from both their faces as they realized what I was holding. Everything you said earlier about the wedding, the divorce plan, the asset division, I continued calmly, it's all recorded. Crystal clear audio that any prosecutor would love to have. Daniel's beer bottle slipped from his nerveless fingers, hitting the table with a loud clink that made other wedding guests glance in our direction. Now, I said, placing the recorder back in my purse, let's discuss what happens next. The wedding reception continued around us in blissful ignorance, while our small corner table had become the epicenter of a carefully controlled earthquake. Daniel was staring at my purse where I'd placed the recorder, his breathing shallow and rapid. Kayley, however, was recovering faster, her mind already working to find an escape route. Elena, she said, her voice taking on that soothing, reasonable tone I remembered from college when she was trying to talk her way out of consequences. Has there? I asked, genuinely curious to see what story she would try to spin. Daniel and I, yes, we've been seeing each other, but it's not what you think. He came to me because he was confused about your relationship, unsure about the wedding. I was trying to help him work through his feelings. The lie was smooth, practiced, and almost believable if you didn't know Kayley's history. As a licensed therapist? I asked innocently. Well, no, but...
Because I looked up your credentials this afternoon. You're not a licensed psychology, Kayley. Your degree is in business administration with a minor in psychology. You work for a data analysis company, not a consulting firm. Another crack in her carefully constructed facade. I was trying to help as a friend, she said, but her voice was becoming more strained. Like you helped Marcus in college? Or Professor Williams? Or that graduate student Jake who ended up dropping out after you convinced him his thesis advisor was sabotaging his work? Daniel's head snapped up at this. What? Oh, you didn't know about Kayley's pattern? I asked, turning to face him fully. Let me fill you in on some of her greatest hits from our college years. Kayley tried to interrupt. Elena, this isn't Marcus Coleman, I continued, ignoring her. My boyfriend junior year. Kayley decided she wanted him, so she started showing up everywhere we went, offering him emotional support for problems she'd helped create, gradually convincing him that I was too demanding, too controlling. Daniel was listening with growing alarm. Within 3 months, she had him questioning everything about our relationship. Within 6 months, she'd isolated him from all his friends by creating drama and conflict wherever she went.
By the end of the year, Marcus was so psychologically damaged that he transferred schools just to get away from the toxicity. That's not what happened, Kayley protested, but her voice lacked conviction. Professor Williams, I continued. Kayley developed an obsession with him during our senior seminar. When he didn't return her interest, she started spreading rumors about inappropriate behavior with students. The investigation cleared him, but the stress caused him to have a heart attack. He was 34 years old. Daniel was staring at Kayley now with something approaching horror. Jake Morrison, no relation, was a graduate student she met at a psychology conference. She convinced him that his thesis advisor was trying to steal his research. He spent so much time fighting battles that didn't exist that he missed crucial deadlines and lost his funding. Elena, you're exaggerating, Kayley started. Am I? Because I kept in touch with Marcus after college. Did you know he spent 2 years in therapy learning to trust his own judgment again? Or that Professor Williams never fully recovered his confidence and ended up leaving academia entirely? The color had completely left Kayley's face. She clearly hadn't expected me to have followed up on the destruction she'd left in her wake. The pattern is always the same, I said, my voice growing harder. You identify someone you want, or someone who has something you want. You insert yourself into their life as a helper, a friend, someone who understands them better than anyone else. Then you slowly isolate them from their support systems while making them dependent on you for emotional validation. Daniel's beer had gone untouched, his attention completely focused on my words. You study their weaknesses, their insecurities, their relationship patterns. Then you use that information to create problems that only you can solve. You make them question their own judgment, their own memories, their own worth. That's enough, Kayley said sharply, her mask finally dropping completely. Is it? Because we haven't gotten to the best part yet. I pulled out my phone again. The part where you destroy them when you're finished playing with them. I scrolled to a series of screenshots I'd taken earlier. Your social media posts from the past 3 years, Kayley. Very interesting reading. Her face went white. Posts about your pathetic ex-roommate who thinks she's so perfect. Photos of my apartment building with captions about stalking the competition. Screenshots of my LinkedIn profile with comments about how some people don't deserve their success. Daniel was staring at Kayley like he'd never seen her before. You've been obsessing over Elena for 3 years? He asked quietly. It's not obsession, Kayley snapped. It's justice. People like Elena coast through life on privilege and luck, while the rest of us have to fight for everything. So you decided to destroy her life? I decided to take what should have been mine from the beginning. The naked honesty of her admission hung in the air between us. Daniel was looking at her with dawning understanding, finally seeing what I'd recognized from the moment I spotted them together. You didn't want me, he said slowly. You wanted to hurt Elena. Kayley's silence was answer enough. My God, Daniel whispered. What have I done? You've been used, I said quietly, just like everyone else Kayley targets. The only difference is that this time I saw it coming. I stood up from the table, gathering my purse and the folder of evidence I'd compiled. Where are you going? Daniel asked desperately.
Home, I said simply, to pack your things and change the locks. Elena, please. No, I said firmly. We're done here, both of you. But as I walked away from the table, I could hear Kayley's voice rising behind me, her careful control finally cracking completely. You think you've won? This isn't over, Elena. This will never over. I didn't turn around. I'd heard those threats before. This time, I was ready for whatever came next. I walked through the reception, past the dancing couples and laughing families, carrying myself with the composure I'd learned to maintain even when my world was collapsing. But this time felt different. This time, I wasn't the victim of someone else's manipulation. I was the one holding all the cards. June intercepted me near the exit, her face glowing with wedding joy that made my heart ache for what I'd thought I had. Elena, leaving so early, the night's just getting started. I'm not feeling well, I said, which was technically true. The weight of the evening's revelations sat heavy in my stomach like stones. Oh no, is there anything I can do? Should I get Daniel?
Daniel's occupied at the moment. I'll be fine. June's expression shifted to concern. Are you sure? You look really pale. I managed a smile. Just tired. It's been a long evening. Thank you for a beautiful wedding, June. I'm so happy for you. I kissed her cheek and walked out into the cool night air, where my phone immediately buzzed with the first of what I knew would be many frantic calls from Daniel. I let it go to voicemail. The drive home took 23 minutes, and I spent every one of them thinking strategically instead of emotionally. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I had a plan. Inside my house, our house, though not for much longer, I moved with methodical precision. First, I gathered all of Daniel's personal belongings and packed them neatly into boxes I'd saved from our last move. His clothes, his books, his toiletries, even the coffee mug he'd claimed was his favorite. Everything went into labeled containers that I stacked by the front door. Then I called a locksmith. Emergency service cost extra, but money was no longer a concern given what I'd discovered about our finances. While I waited for the locksmith to arrive, I opened my laptop and began the real work, canceling credit cards, freezing accounts, documenting every fraudulent transaction I could find. The evidence folder grew thicker with each discovery. My phone rang constantly, Daniel's name appearing on the screen over and over. Finally, I answered. Elena, thank God, we need to talk. No, I said calmly, we don't. Your belongings are packed and will be on the front porch in the morning. The locks are being changed tonight. You can't just. I can, and I am. Don't contact me again, Daniel. Any further communication goes through my attorney. Attorney? Elena, you're overreacting. Am I? Because I've spent the last hour documenting $23,000 in theft, plus credit fraud, plus conspiracy to commit fraud. My attorney thinks it's a very solid case. The line went quiet. I trusted you, I continued. I loved you. I was planning to spend my life with you. And you repaid that by stealing from me and planning to humiliate me at my own wedding? I never meant. Yes, you did. You and Kayley planned every detail. The only thing you didn't plan for was getting caught. I hung up and turned off my phone. The locksmith arrived 10 minutes later, and by midnight, my house was secure. For the first time in months, I felt safe in my own home. But I wasn't finished with Kayley Lynch, not by a lot shot. 3 weeks later, I sat in my attorney's office reviewing the final paperwork for what would become the most satisfying conversation of my life. Margaret Bardem, my lawyer, was a sharp woman in her 50s who specialized in financial crimes and had taken particular interest in my case. Everything's in order, she said, sliding the documents across her mahogany desk. The credit card companies have reversed all fraudulent charges, the bank has restored your stolen funds with interest, and we've built a compelling case for prosecution. What about the recorded confession? Pure gold. Daniel admitting to the wedding scheme and Kayley acknowledging their conspiracy gives us everything we need for federal charges. I nodded, feeling a calm satisfaction settle over me. And the restraining order? Approved. Kayley Lynch is prohibited from contacting you, coming within 500 feet of your home or workplace, or attempting any form of communication through third parties. But I knew Kayley better than the legal system did. A restraining order was just paper to someone like her, a minor inconvenience, not a real deterrent. There's something else, Margaret continued. My investigator did some digging into Miss Lynch's background. You might find this interesting. She handed me a thick folder. Turns out you weren't her first obsession. There's a pattern going back to high school. 3 different women over the past decade, all with similar stories to yours. I opened the folder and found myself looking at police reports, restraining orders, and victim statements that read like variations of my own experience. Sarah Martinez from high school, whose college boyfriend had mysteriously broken up with her after meeting Kayley at a party. Jennifer Quinn from community college, who'd lost a job opportunity after Kayley spread rumors about her work ethic to potential employers. They're all willing to testify, Margaret said quietly. You're not fighting this alone. That afternoon, I made a call I'd been planning for weeks. Kayley, it's Elena. We need to talk. The silence on the other end stretched for several seconds before she responded. I thought you had a restraining order against me. I do, but you called me first. I smiled, knowing she couldn't see it, but hoping she could hear it in my voice. 15 minutes ago, from a blocked number, something about wanting to make things right. Another pause. Kayley was clearly trying to figure out how I'd known it was her. Meet me at Cafe Luna on 5th Street, I continued. 1 hour. Come alone. Why would I do that? Because I have something that belongs to you. And because if you don't show up, my next call is to the district attorney's office. I hung up before she could respond. Cafe Luna was perfect for what I needed, public enough to be safe, but with enough ambient noise that our conversation wouldn't be overheard. I arrived early and chose a corner table with a clear view of all entrances, then ordered a coffee I didn't want and waited. Kayley walked in exactly on time, her movements cautious as she scanned the room for threats. She looked thinner than she had at the wedding, with dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. When she spotted me, her expression shifted through several emotions: anger, fear, resignation, before settling on the cold calculation I remembered from college. She approached my table like she was walking into a trap, which, of course, she was. Kayley slid into the chair across from me with the wariness of a predator who'd suddenly realized she might be prey. She dressed carefully for this meeting: professional blazer, minimal makeup, her hair pulled back in a style that suggested competence and respectability. Classic Kayley, trying to control the narrative even when she had no power left. You look tired, I said, stirring sugar into my coffee. What do you want, Elena? To give you this. I slid a manila envelope across the cable. Open it. She hesitated, then picked up the envelope and peered inside. Her face went pale as she recognized the contents: copies of police reports, victim statements, and psychological evaluations from her previous targets. Where did you get these? Does it matter? The important thing is what they represent. I leaned forward slightly. A pattern, Kayley. 15 years of destroying people's lives, documented in official records across 3 states. Her hands were trembling as she rifled through the papers. These are sealed juvenile records. Some of them. Others are public documents that anyone with the right connections can access. I paused. My attorney has excellent connections. Kayley's confident mask was cracking, revealing the desperate woman underneath. What do you want? I want you to understand something you've never grasped before. I kept my voice calm, almost gentle. Actions have consequences. Is this some kind of revenge fantasy? Because I won't. This isn't revenge, I interrupted. This is justice. There's a difference. I pulled out my phone and opened a voice recording app, setting it on the table between us. Tell me about Daniel. I'm not saying anything that can be used. The recording from the wedding is already evidence in a federal case. This conversation is just for my own curiosity. I smiled. How long had you been planning it? Kayley stared at the phone, then at me, clearly trying to calculate her options. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Since graduation, I never stopped watching you, Elena. Your social media, your job, your apartment. When you posted about Daniel's promotion, I knew he'd be the perfect target. Because he had money? Because he had access to yours. Her voice was gaining strength now, fed by old resentments. You've always had everything handed to you. Perfect family, perfect grades, perfect opportunities. It wasn't fair. So you decided to take it all away? I decided to level the playing field. Kayley's eyes flashed with anger. You never appreciated what you had. Daniel told me how you took him for granted, how you were always too busy with work to pay attention to him. Except that wasn't true. Wasn't it? Kayley leaned forward, her mask slipping further. You worked 60-hour weeks, missed date nights for client meetings, prioritized your career over your relationship. Daniel was lonely, Elena. I just gave him what he needed. You gave him what you wanted him to need, I corrected, just like you did with Marcus, with Professor Williams, with everyone else you've targeted. Kayley sat ack, some of her defiance returning. So what? I'm good at reading people, at giving them what they want. That's not a crime. Credit fraud is a crime. Conspiracy is a crime. Identity theft is a crime. You can't prove I knew about any of that. I smiled then, the first genuine smile I'd felt in weeks. Actually, I can. I reached into my purse and pulled out a second phone, Daniel's phone, which he'd left behind in his panicked flight from the wedding reception. Funny thing about text messages, I said, they leave such a detailed record of conspiracy. Kayley's face went white as she realized what I was holding. Make sure the credit applications go through before she gets suspicious, I read aloud. The cash advances need to happen during her business trips. Transfer everything to the offshore account we discussed. With each message, Kayley seemed to shrink further into her chair. There are 47 messages between you and Daniel discussing the details of defrauding me, complete with timelines, amounts, and methods. I set the phone down gently. The federal prosecutor was particularly interested in the offshore account part. Kayley was staring at the phone like it was a venomous snake. Here's what's going to happen, I continued, my voice still calm but carrying an edge of steel. You're going to disappear from my life completely. No more watching, no more following, no more inserting yourself into my world. And if I don't, then you'll discover what it feels like to be the one whose life gets systematically destroyed. 6 months later, I received a letter from the Federal Correctional Institution in Dublin, California. The return address showed Kayley's full name and inmate number. I held it for a long moment, feeling the weight of closure in my hands, then dropped it unopened into my paper shredder. Some conversations were finally over. I was sitting in my home office, the same room where Daniel used to take his mysterious phone calls, reviewing proposals for my new consulting business. The financial fraud case had given me unexpected expertise in corporate security, and several companies had approached me about helping them identify and prevent internal theft. It felt fitting somehow, using what Kayley had taught me about manipulation and deception to protect other people from experiencing what I'd gone through. My phone buzzed with a text from Margaret Bardem. Sentencing hearing complete. Kayley got 18 months federal, Daniel got 2 years. Restitution order finalized. You can finally close this chapter. I typed back. Thank you for everything. Couldn't have done this without you. The truth was, I could have done it without her, but it would have been much messier and far less satisfying. Having the legal system validate what I'd experienced, seeing Kayley and Daniel face real consequences for their actions, that had been worth every hour spent in depositions and court hearings. A knock at my front door interrupted my thoughts. I looked through the peephole and saw a woman about my age holding a manila folder, looking nervous but determined. "Mrs. Morrison," she said when I opened the door, "my name is Cassandra Everett. I think we need to talk about Kayley Lynch." I studied her face, the exhausted eyes, the careful way she held herself, the folder clutched like a lifeline. I recognized the expression. I'd worn it myself not so long ago. "She's in prison," I said gently. "I know, but before she was arrested, she was dating my fiancé. They had plans." Cassandra's voice cracked slightly. "I think she was going to do to me what she did to you." I stepped aside to let her in. "Come in, let's talk." Over the next 2 hours, I listened to Cassandra's story. It was depressingly familiar. The systematic manipulation, the financial irregularities, the gradual isolation from friends and family. But this time, Kayley had been arrested before she could complete her plan. The FBI agent who interviewed me said I should talk to you. She said you might understand what I'm going through. I do understand, and I can help you make sure she never gets the chance to do this to anyone else. We spent the rest of the afternoon going through Cassandra's evidence, building a case that would extend Kayley's sentence and establish a pattern that would follow her for the rest of her life. As Cassandra was leaving, she turned back to me. "How do you do it? How do you trust people again after something like this?" I thought about the question seriously. Carefully, I said finally, but I don't let her steal that from me too. Being able to trust, to love, to believe in good intentions, those are strengths, not weaknesses. I just learned to trust my instincts along with my heart. That evening, I stood in my kitchen making dinner for one, looking out at the garden I'd planted in the spring. The flowers were blooming now, bright splashes of color in the gathering dusk. My phone rang, and I glanced at the caller ID. Jonas Coleman, a colleague from my new consulting firm. We'd been working together on a case involving corporate embezzlement, and somewhere along the way, professional respect had started growing into something more personal. "Hi, Jonas," I answered, surprised by how easily the smile came to my voice. "Elena, I hope I'm not calling too late. I wanted to ask if you'd like to have dinner tomorrow night. Nothing work-related, just dinner." I looked around my house, my sanctuary, my safe space, entirely my own again. Then I thought about Cassandra's question, about trust and healing and the choice between letting fear rule your life or choosing to remain open to possibility. "I'd like that," I said. "I'd like that very much." After we hung up, I realized something that would have surprised the woman I'd been a year ago. I was genuinely excited about tomorrow. Kayley Lynch had tried to steal my life, my money, my future, my capacity for trust. But in the end, she'd only succeeded in making me stronger, wiser, and more grateful for the genuine connections I'd managed to build in spite of her attempts at destruction. Some stories end with revenge, others end with justice, but the best ones end with healing and the courage to begin again. And as I turned off the lights and headed upstairs, I realized that sometimes, just sometimes, the most satisfying ending of all is simply becoming someone who refuses to let the darkness win.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.